that one of my old closest comrades in Scotland, who's, I don't think he was even registered to vote for, I don't know when, even though it shouldn't, in theory he should have been, but very active, well, despite some other deviations I won't go into, but otherwise very active in local sort of anti-cut stuff and all that, from a sort of autonomous and anarchist position and all that. And I would say a hardline anti-nationalist. And when I corresponded with him just before the referendum, he actually, you know, in a very honest kind of exchange between comrades, as it were, said he was tempted, I think that was the word, he was tempted this time to register and vote for the independence in the referendum, and vote for the yes. And he put, I think he put, if only, to shake things up a bit. And I think in my response, I kind of said, well, I think I kind of I understand where you're coming from, type of thing. I'm trying to be a bit sympathetic. But in all honesty, isn't the fact that you feel like that, because it wasn't really a very sort of intellectualised thing, the very fact that you just feel like that is a reflection of, well, frankly, our politics, including his and mine and yours, our kind of politics, how remote really that is in terms of having any roots in or influence in working class struggle. So despite all his efforts in propaganda efforts, putting leaflets out around, you know, the public sector strikes in Edinburgh and all the rest of it, we come from Edinburgh, but despite all his activist efforts around that, you know, I had to say, in a way that did reflect it, you know, I think people felt they'd been buffeted and pissed around, and despite their best efforts to sort of generate some genuine class opposition to all the austerity measures and all that, and all the privatisation and the public sector cut, and all those things, which he was very active in, that people got to a point where they thought, well, we're just not winning, you know, and it was like almost an act of desperation, almost anything that they thought might just shake things up a bit, would mean that they would go down that road. Interestingly, I don't think he ever actually told me whether he voted in the end, perhaps he was too embarrassed. On the other hand, you know, it was a big debate and in Scotland, and I know it was quite a contentious thing in local discussions that went on in that kind of milieu. Now, some organisations, to be fair, stuck to their guns. I mean, the Anarchist Federation in Scotland was very clear. Well, some people might say it wasn't 100% clear, but it was pretty clear in terms of not voting for either way in the referendum, not taking part, not either way in the referendum. But lots of other people changed. And then there was that whole argument, which was very common in broader kind of left-wing circles, that, oh, well, of course, you know, and I suppose it's the whole sort of Trotsky thing, really, isn't it? It's like, well, you've got to be like where people are with, sort of thing. And, you know, the fact that it generated so much discussion, even though it was all a bit mixed up. And there was this kind of, if you remember, there was a kind of radical conference wing that tried to organise people for the referendum. But it did involve a lot of discussion about other things. It's like, well, you know, where do we want to go with this? You know, we want to keep the activity going after the referendum, not to support the SNP in particular, or even independence, but to generate a sort of grassroots opposition to the practicalities of what was happening. And that undoubtedly carried quite a bit of weight. Now, of course, from my point of view, it didn't do what they thought it would do, because what it actually delivered was a vote for the SNP in the election. So it didn't really deliver that. But anyway, I suppose that's where it was coming from, really. And I just thought that was a sort of leading, you know, and I don't know, you know, you said, well, what happened in the election? Well, the Labour Party, and we could argue about the reasons for that, but some of the reason was, I suppose, well, some of the reason was simply that it didn't even have the vestiges of its old, any kind of slim vestige of any kind of old social democratic sort of idea about it, and people just realised that and so on. But on the other hand, it was just a nationalist reaction as well to the fact that they, well, sat there with the Tories and opposed the independents, you know, and pro-UK and all that. So it was a really mixed bunch. On the other hand, you know, they were going on the Labour Party, like heavily defeated, worst defeat ever. But actually, in terms of the number of votes, it wasn't a huge change, you know. So, I mean, but it does seem like, it does seem like a lot of people thought, well, you know, a lot of people were, I think, pissed off and afraid in many cases of what was going on, but they were as likely, because of the effects of nationalism, if you like, to vote in opposition to austerity with UKIP or the SNP or any other faction, if you see what I mean. And but certainly not encouraging, is it? In terms of people's feelings about things, and I have to keep using that word because a lot of what people do not, you know, they don't resonate as a result of any kind of deep-seated intellectual analysis or discussion. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh, well, what the fuck, and all sorts of pressures, you know, impact on people. But just think, but having said that, you know, the extreme left-wing parties, of course, did nothing useful at all. I mean, even the SPGB managed to get as many votes as some of them, which is pretty amazing. So they're just saying, all we want is socialism. So I mean, you know, so nothing happened there. And you could say, well, that is partly it's why I put on my links a reference to this phrase, although it's used in different ways. The thing about capitalist realism, you know, is that, you know, capitalism has moved on in all sorts of ways, but we don't really see a class response. On the other hand, most working class people realise that the sort of programme of the actual extreme left, you know, of sort of nationalise this and do that and we'll all be right for proper, you know, all the things that the traditional left, you know, is obviously a waste of space, not going anywhere, will never happen because capitalism's already gone way past that, you know, and he's not likely to return to it. So in a sense, you know, ordinary workers realise that, you know, and think, well, they're not, you know, what's the point of voting for them? So, you know, in the absence of any genuine feeling of sort of working class strength or the possibility of something genuinely different to capitalism, then people are just pushed back into all the other kind of options on offer. And one of them happens to be, well, you know, smaller, you know, smaller, withdraw, smaller, you know, Scotland on its own, or Hebrides on its own, or, you know, Northern Italy on its own, if we're talking about Europe, or, you know, or Catalonia, or, you know, like there's a whole kind of dispersal going on there, because it's like people, in a way, people going backwards and back to the roots from which they'd already left, you know, but it's still capitalism, Anyway, I'm waffling now, but I'll just throw that in, try and get people going. I don't know what other people thought about that much.
Can I just ask a procedural question? Who's chairing? I'm looking at you, Phil.
Am I?
You set the meeting up. It's your club.
Okay. Oh, good.
I thought because you had the big wooden armchair, actually, they'll get you out.
This is my shouting at the SPGB chair.
I did look at it, start recording that, by the way.
Sorry?
So Mike's kind of the instruction.
Right, okay.
Right,
That's
who's next then? Mark.
Yeah, a couple of points coming up from that. The first is this notion of the radical, kind of radical grassroots movement for a yes vote in Scotland, and that didn't deliver what people thought, because what it became was a sort of radical recruiting arm for the SNP. I think, well, I wonder if there's a problem there in thinking that a radical movement, and for the benefit of the tape, I'm doing little bunny ears here. If a radical movement for the referendum would ever deliver anything other than a recuperation by bourgeois politics, is there any possibility of something like that having a positive dynamic, or is it inevitable that it's going to end up being a ginger group for some bourgeois party? My own view is that if you start from the basis that you're going to have a radical group that opposes the current status of the British state with another way of organising the constituent parts of the British state, then it is inevitably trapped in the politics of the ruling class, even if it does have a kind of radical face and people want it to be something more than just a single issue campaign that is about constitutional reform. Because if you start on that basis, then that's all you're going to end up with, I think. Under what people thought that very sketchy and a dismissive critique of such a notion.
Yep, go
I'll
on.
answer. Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with your analysis, Mark. But it was a, I suppose, it was a nationalist. It might have been. I don't actually think it was particularly that radical, really. It was nothing that. It was never particularly even that radical. I don't think. The fact that the left and certain anarchists, a lot of anarchists actually, I was even told that, yeah, but if we have Scottish independence, we can let all the immigrants in because we've got lots of space. And now it's just like, it doesn't kind of work like that. I think you're kind of misunderstanding capitalism and how the system works in the first place. If you think, oh, somehow we're going to put everybody on these hills in Scotland, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there was anything particularly radical at all about Scottish. The fact that the leftists kind of got drawn into it, and various anarchist groups got drawn into it a little bit in various ways. It was always about Scottish nationalism. It was always about the Scottish ruling class wanted to control their own resources, and consequently, what happened is everybody else got trashed because the Scottish nationalists were always going to win, I think. I don't think there could have been any other outcome.
Nick?
I think the whole question, Scottish nationalism or any other form of nationalism, it's purely a bourgeois issue, and it's got, there's no other side to it whatsoever, and it can't be radical in any way,
We're going round the room now.
shape or form. And the other thing is, I think this whole, nationalist issue in Scotland, I think most Scots, apart from obviously the hardcore SNP, don't give a damn, really, whether they're independent or not. It's just the SNP happened to jump on the bandwagon of let's hit Labour, because they knew Labour had done fuck all for anyone. They knew the feeling. And it was purely, they're the only party that's standing up for us sort of thing against the Tories, and Labour are shite now. And they really couldn't give two hoots whether they were part of the UK or not.
Yeah, it's less about being part of the UK and more about not being shat on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we just going around the room then?
Yeah,
We are by default. I think there's certainly a current there which Mike started off with, which is this gut feeling as opposed to analysis and consciousness. And there's going to be an enormous amount of exploitation of that going on in London today. I mean, you turn the television on, you see characters, you don't know how they manage to do it. How do characters like Osborne and Cameron appear so much as caricatures of high Tories? It's amazing. They must practice in front of mirrors to say, how can I appear to be the most obnoxious strain of Toryism that anyone's ever come across? Oh yeah, but we've got it very good. So it's and there is a gut instinct which says, God Almighty, it's the 1970s Socialist Worker headline, Tory snouts back in the trough. There's that gut feeling which totally lacks analysis, totally lacks understanding, totally understands what the real crisis which is actually causing austerity. It's actually not these horrible old Etonians who are causing austerity, it's the fact that capitalism is in a crisis which it can't solve. Now the problem is, what's going on in London today is there's lots of people with megaphones from all sorts of bits and bobs of the left of the establishment saying, oh, you're absolutely right, it's these horrid old Etonians, and they bailed out the profligate bankers, and they're horrid as well. And good Lord, you know, we can do better than this, because there used to be a welfare state in 1945, you know, and if only we could have that, we're all laughing, so do that for the next 5 years and elect a Labour Party. So, and it seems to me that we've actually got quite a big task at the moment, because what the left, I think, are quite consciously doing is trying to rerun 1979. If Cameron was called Maggie, it'd be Maggie, 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 out, 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 camo, 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 out, out, out. It'd be People's March for Jobs from Liverpool to London. It's going to be translated in People's March Against Austerity by the People's Assembly, from some benighted hurl to another benighted hurl. May or may not get beaten up by the police at the end of it, who knows. But I think certainly you listen to someone like Lindsay German, and she is quite consciously saying, this is what we're going to do, this is 1979 all over again, this is where we're going. So at the same time as that sort of unthinking anti-Toryism, you've got the blinking EU referendum is going to be overlaid on it as a great diversion and carnival for the next couple of years. And in the 1970s, the left, because they had to be where the class was, actually it's because the class were there because they were unconscious. In the 70s, almost all the Trot left bailed in as left nationalists. A few of us who were Trot left actually didn't, but that's another story. But the main Trot left, and things are a bit more complicated now, largely because the anti-campaign is tainted by the very unpleasant UKIP people. So the leftists have to be a bit canny about what version of left nationalism they spout, because heaven forbid that they sound like the other radical nationalists from UKIP. So they have to be a bit careful. But there's certainly going to be two parallel things going on over the next few years, which is this unthinking anti-Toryism and being dragooned into either anti-EUism or anti-British statism. And I think this is rambling because like half a dozen notes spread across a page here. It's this anti-establishmentism which I think the SNP turned into between the referendum and the general election. I think there were elements of anti-establishmentism in the referendum, but certainly once they lost it, they were laughing their little socks off, weren't they? Because they actually then appear as the anti-establishment and even anti-austerity party, which is total bollocks. The record in government in Scotland, there's no evidence whatsoever, not a shred of evidence that in any way anti-austerity. But because they lost the referendum, they're able to take on that anti-austerity mantle, which Labour wasn't doing. And you know, what happens there is pretty obvious. The election actually for the extreme left was disastrous. There's a video of immediately after the election, the two great left electoral alliances, Tusk and Left Unity in inverted commas, met in Sheffield to cry on each other's shoulders and to say that they must try harder to reinvigorate a Labour movement that probably never really existed anyway. I've got a link to that, and I think I might write a bit of a commentary on it. But clearly, again, that's part of this perspective for them wanting to rebuild the mythical left. Last point.
Sorry,
Okay.
no, I was just interested in that.
Yeah, last point, workplace, reality, working class. People may or may not have read a few months ago, we stuck a thing up on the website about how basically the council was going to smash the housing service in Sheffield and was smashing the workforce at the same time. Now what happened was, and that was about 6 months ago, certainly at that time, if any of us had been able to press the levers which said mass meeting the whole workforce, without a doubt the whole workforce would have said, we don't want this, this is a load of shit, we understand it, it's an absolute disaster, we want to take action, without a doubt. Now the unions didn't even hold, there's 3 different unions involved, none of them held a big open meeting to challenge it, not even as individuals. What they did do was they negotiated and bullshitted for several months, and I think it was absolutely deliberate that they waited till the elections were out of the way. They then escalated the issue to their regional conveners away from the lay conveners, regional conveners totally pissing in the same pot as the senior Labour councillors in Sheffield, effectively the same people and certainly in the same circles. And for the last month, the housing service ran a series of road shows for staff at which you weren't allowed to say anything about the reorganisation. They ended on Thursday afternoon. On Thursday at 5 o'clock, every member of staff was emailed to say, right, the reorganisation is now happening, tough titty, lots of you are going to lose £2,000, lots of you are going to be downgraded, all your basic conditions are going, ain't that a shame? And Friday morning in work, 1 or 2 people said, yeah, you were saying that we should have been organised and fighting 6 months ago, and that was quite nice. But the reaction was, from most people, well, fuck that, why am I paying a £5 a month to a union which can't defend what is clearly the most basic attack and blatant attack that we could all see was happening. And I wish we'd had some Tusk or Left Unity or Trock Clown in there, because the only union rep we had in there was just keeping her head down, just saying nothing. But you know how these people would have countered that, because you know they would always want the fight to go through the traditional channels, through the labour movement and that crap. Whereas people are now saying, and it's actually on the back of the Aurora to some extent, people are hedging towards saying, well actually that sort of strategy ain't any use anymore. They can't really understand other strategies except in isolated odd sparky places you can. But for the next period, I think it's clear what the left are going to be saying, and it's quite clear what we say in opposition to them.
Thank you. No, I'll go first and then. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I found sort of one of the interesting stats with the election was that UKIP got many more votes than the SNP, yet ended up with 1 seat, and the SNP gets its 50 odd seats or whatever, which I thought was quite an interesting sort of work out of these things. But the Scottish referendum, I think the Scottish referendum sort of follows through with that result into the EU referendum, which is what I wanted to come on, because it's again a battle of nationalisms, isn't it? The EU referendum, as Keith says, is going to be around for a couple of years now, and it's going to be an awful lot for us. Keith?
Maybe not.
Oh, I got it wrong again.
K-V.
K.
Yeah, I often get Keith though, it's alright Phil.
I think mostly from me, sorry.
No, lots of people do.
I'll write it down. It's a battle of nationalisms, and it's going to end up as sort of the English nationalists against Europe, and those that are arguing that British national interest is in staying in the EU, and that's going to be the basis of it. What I find interesting, I think, though, is that the side that won this sort of British nationalism one on the Scottish referendum is going to be the one that is going to be arguing against the staying in the EU, and given sort of the practice over many years, sort of I saw from teaching how, you know, I started off getting lots of people interested as they came in and what was it all about and trying to find out things. But the press and the politics have put so much sort of anti-EU stuff out there, so much pro-British and anti-EU stuff, that I think it could be a very hard one for them to win, actually. That there is a real good chance that it could come out as a sort of staying in the EU. Possibly that's going to be what happens with Greece is going to be quite a critical thing to that as well, and quite how this works out with Greece. I think will have a big influence. But it's interesting that it's two conflicts as well. It's the economy versus economic arguments versus political arguments, staying in or coming out, and it cuts right across left and right. I think there are elements on both left and right they're going to be for and against, and it's going to cut across the two as well. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how it works out. But I think we're going to be strained to the gills again with a whole load of sort of strongly nationalist ranting on one direction or another for a couple of years, which is going to be a bit of a pain. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, first of all, on the Scottish sort of a question, I think going back to what Mark said to start with, I think the only way it could serve anything other than the establishment if people actually jumped ship and actually went into something more radical or more involved with class struggle politics, because it's a total dead end. You know, it's completely reactionary, nationalist thing. I think the SNP are even worse than that, to be honest, apart from the fact not even particularly left-wing or radical anyway. You know, they're as part of the establishment as the Tories, and they serve exactly the same sort of purpose in maintaining status quo. Splitting votes, nationalism, you know, it's all completely the same as UKIP or the Tories or Labour or even, you know, and it was said that Sturgeon secretly wanted the Tories to win. No, I think that's quite a possibility. I think she very likely did. Like when the speaker said earlier on, they lost the Scottish referendum, and the Tories were in power on the one hand, and they picked up a sizable number of seats, on a third of what UKIP got, and got 50 times as many seats, incidentally, which shows what the whole thing is altogether. You know, it suits them because they can distance themselves. They can say, oh, we're more radical than the Labour Party. At the same time, they serve the establishment purpose of splitting Labour vote and putting the Tories in, possibly again in 2020. And I would like to start about this the actual turnout in the election. The Tories actually got 37% with 66% turnout. So the number of people who didn't vote was actually bigger than any party's got. And we don't want to and it obviously be a big mistake to sort of fall into the trap of saying, well, people who don't vote are more class conscious or can see the light more than people who do vote, or going down the road of saying, oh, it's all down to the two-party system. You know, it'd be a big sort of mistake to go down that sort of road. You know, we need to emphasise the fact this is how they actually get things to work, you know. At the end of the day, the election, obviously elections serve, you know, the ruling class. And this last election, quite admirably, you know, served the interests of the state. Because everyone was saying how unexpected it was. The Tories got a landslide, well, I think it's a landslide, but got an overall majority. And apparently nobody's expecting that.
Don't know why.
But it's exactly, I mean, that's quite interesting. And this is quite interesting what he said. A lot of people who I spoke to, including myself, actually did predict an overall majority. And yet nobody, you know, actually officially was predicting it. So, yeah, you know, this is how it actually happens. You know, actually serve the actual interests of the class. You know, it's very interesting, you know. It's a rerun, like Kev was saying, you know, of the early 80s. And we were saying, you know, before the discussion started about the three of us saying, why go down to London when you've got exactly the same thing that was happening 35 years ago? Some of us have been around. When I came on the scene in the early 20s, I would have thought, great, anti-Tory. It's against the Tories, let's go down there, let's demonstrate, we'll really start something here, we'll get the bastards out. Like we did in 1974. In 1980, I really thought that was going to happen. You join, the left, all these anti-union laws, all the way to stand for it, there'll be a general strike and Tories will be out. Talking about being in 1981. What's happened? We're until 97. And we had successions of Tory election victory. This election reminds me of 92 in many ways. The same sort of way it was managed, the same sort of prediction. It was almost a rerun of the 92 election when John Major got re-elected. So it's just, any sort of participation from Labour, who I think are quite glad they lost, as well as Nicola Sturgeon, they're all in this election, this leadership election thing. It's all about, basically preparing themselves for long periods in opposition. Because what would Labour have done if they got in? Exactly the same. Slower austerity, spread out a bit more, spread the misery out a bit more. What would they have done? They didn't have any policies, nor did the far left. All they offered was more and more of the same. And, it's like this EU referendum thing. Obviously it's going to take up quite a lot of time in the next sort of couple of years. But, one thing can be certain, it's going to be a staged manage, as the Scottish referendum was. There's this big argument about whether the government's going to rig it or not, or whether they're going to let people have the free hand for voting and all that. But one thing that could happen was that they could burn the fingers the same way as they did with the Scottish referendum, because that came dangerously close to losing it. The no side came at about 10% of winning, and there was a sort of all-out panic to actually get people to jump ship, or this threat about businesses pulling out of Scotland and all that. And that could well happen again with this, the EU referendum, because the establishment clearly wants the EU to stop in, Britain to stop in.
Already happened.
Yeah, it's already happened. Clearly want us to stop in, and they're going to make sure it happens. They're not going to make sure, the same thing doesn't happen as with the Scottish referendum, when it nearly got out of hand and nearly got the wrong result. So, that's it really.
Well, good lad. There's always a problem with being last, because everyone's had the opportunity to say lots of things. And also I haven't done my homework for the meeting, so what I'll say is very general. I think what Mark said about the SNP being put forward as an alternative, posed as an alternative, the fact that that was able to happen is, in my mind, mainly due to the lack of a real alternative. So of course, it's not that hard to make the SNP and their supposed anti-austerity programme rhetoric look radical when there is really no alternative. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of different groups have been trying to touch on recently in various texts. And I think Kevin's contribution was interesting in this idea of the way that where are the working class in all of what's happened, and there are various, you can imagine various dynamics from the events. So the Labour Party gets rejuvenated by the result. They can have this leader campaign. The left, in the face of Jeremy Corbyn, is pushed forward. We have this supposed, another supposed radical alternative. But as Kevin said, the radical alternative is a return to 1945, or 1945 forever. This is not. It ignores everything that's happened since 1945. It also ignores bigger things that are happening in Europe, in the world, and so on. And it's a very dangerous idea that will pull those people who are seeking to question capital into its orbit. And I think that is one of the things that's a real challenge for those of us who see ourselves as posing a real alternative, and how we get across our ideas. Because I think Mike's point about feelings, it's nice. It's a nice way of putting it, because we want, when we talk about people, sometimes when we talk about consciousness, we expect this sort of almost ideological view, everyone to have a position on the election and things like that. Whereas, we know that people don't really respond like that, but they do respond in all sorts of other ways, and they are able to see the potentials of what's happening. But they can't. I do think that people can't see a real alternative, and it's how to pose that real alternative. And what will happen in the EU election and as I say, the Labour Party, well, all these alternatives will be posed, but no one will be posing a communism, a real alternative. And I think that's the difficulty for everyone in this room to get across. And today's demonstration is a good example. We could have been there making our case, but our voice is too small at the moment.
Nick?
Slightly change the subject, but I wanted to get it in before I forgot. It's interesting, the Greek government's argument over their repayments, etc. But we've got a mandate from the people. We've been elected, so we can't go along with it, and you're actually you're going against democracy, by trying to force us to. I thought that could potentially become quite an interesting situation. You'll certainly, if the Greeks are seen to gain anything from that argument, it's certainly going to give fuel to the likes of, Sturgeon. Potentially, if Labour's got any nouns at all, they'll pick up and run with that and build an anti-austerity movement or whatever, And I just thought I'd throw that in, because I think that, potentially that could be an interesting situation.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the Greece thing as well, actually. One of the few things I've actually managed to watch on TV at work has been the BBC Business Today programme at 5:30 in the morning.
I watched that.
But it's actually quite interesting. It's actually quite interesting because every single day, pretty much every single day, they discuss Greece. And for the past year, every single day, they've basically gone, oh, there's this deadline. And this deadline's going to come in, it might be May 30th now, it's June 31st. They've got to have a settlement by...
June the 31st.
It's Monday, isn't it?
There is no 31st of June.
That's why it's a crisis.
It's 1st of July, 1st of July, yeah. I'll change it 1st of July then. That's good actually, having a few days left. But basically, yeah, so they've just constantly got it, and it'd be interesting to see what happens on July the 1st, to see whether it does all fall apart. Because if it all falls apart, that will have a massive impact on the referendum here as well. What happens here? How will the Tories feel about? Clearly, Cameron wants to stay in the. None of them particularly want to leave really, apart from the people on the backbenchers. But if Greece goes, what happens to the Europe? Because it's not simply about an economic fact. Obviously, it's about the economic reasons are behind it, but the EU was created on a political basis about the European Union. It'd be also interesting to see how the left react both to if it does all fall apart in Greece, and also how they will position themselves in a referendum. Because in 1974, the left took the Little England position, by and large, they're not going to be able to do that in the same way they did then because of UKIP. So they're going to want to distance themselves a little bit. It wouldn't surprise me if certain left groups actually don't take a pro-Europe position on the basis of the United States of Europe kind of take on it. Yeah, not all of them, some of them will, I think. I mean, whether any take a more abstentionist position, which I presume everybody's room. I would hope everybody's room
socialist
take.
resistance were sort of lining up against.
They would run up and against.
As an against, but
That's
not
they're
as
the,
a nationalist opposition.
they're the ex-SWPers, are they? Are they ex-SWP?
IMG, wasn't it? I don't know. It's a mixture of
SS.
everything.
Yeah.
Thought it.
So I mean, I think that would be probably the case with them. But some of the, I mean, the old work power group and some of those people might have a bit more nuanced position.
Just a footnote on that, so I want to sort of come back on some other bit sometime. But just as a footnote on that, yeah, I think you're right. You would certainly suspect that some of the ones might draw the logic of their own positions and recognise that actually they understand this one capital lash up versus another, and they might end up icing their arguments and dressing it up with all the social benefits that the EU has given us, as opposed to what the nasty Tory British government is taking away from us. And you can certainly see some sort of framework around that which would strengthen that bit of nonsense.
I mean, if you look at Syriza, the left-wing party in government, they went on the basis of a pro-European position, essentially. They're not, I mean, the classic left, if you want, left-wing of capital was always to pull out of Europe, but they went for a pro position. So, I mean, it's just quite interesting what the different groups will take.
Like,
Is that all right? Why don't you go
yeah,
first
no,
then?
it's Mike first, but
Well,
But
were you putting your name down?
yes.
Yes, right. It's Mike next.
well, just a few sort of nitty-gritty little bits, as it were, and then one more fundamental one, which we can perhaps discuss maybe later, actually. But just the thing on Scotland and the ruling class and economics and politics. Not that anybody was actually asserted. I don't think anybody actually asserted this, but I mean, there isn't such a thing as a Scottish ruling class as such. I mean, large parts of capital in Scotland is already international, multinational, all the rest of it. So, I mean, clearly there were sections of capital in Scotland that did line up on the basis of independence and pro-referendum, but then there were many that were against it as well. What does that mean? Well, it means the ruling class, if you like, was split over the issue, both in Scotland and in the UK and elsewhere. But it also perhaps should remind us that there is sometimes there are interests in the political bureaucracy that don't always fully align neatly with the interests in the ruling class. So, they do have some interests of their own. They can't be totally independent or autonomous, but they have some manoeuvre and wriggle room as well. So, we can't always read things as sort of a nice, neat correlation between specific bits of the ruling class, and certainly not a national ruling class, because really national ruling classes are a bit of a thing of the past in some ways. Okay, so that was one point about Scotland. Thing about votes, just thought I'd mention, but I probably have mentioned this before, but there's a programme on Radio 4 which is all about statistics, so people listen to it. And they did one good one where somebody wrote to them and said, well, there's a lot of arguments about the fact that, which was sort of mentioned, how SNP got this large number of seats on the basis of proportionately fairly small number of votes and all the rest of it. And of course, at one of the demonstrations quickly after the election in Trafalgar Square, I noticed the people at that had a big banner about, representation and proportion, things should be proportional. It was unfair, like we're all for elections, but they were unfair, And anyway, so they asked this question, and they looked at, I mean, one of the types of proportional elections, they can't really work it out, you know, but there are two others that could have been used and have been used elsewhere. And they said, well, what would have been the result if you used either of these other two systems? And they said, well, yes, it's true, the SNP, you know, would have got less seats, but would have still got quite a lot. The Labour Party would have got less seats still, even less seats than they got now. The Greens would have got slightly more, and UKIP would have got a lot more. You know, basically. So, but if you added it all up, and in conventional political terms, it meant a big shift to the right. Basically, if you added UKIP and Tory together and a few others, you know. But anyway, so that's just a matter, and it's an important point in some ways, just because there's so much guff about the issue is one of democracy, you know, and there's so much emphasis on that. No, not about power, but it's like, well, we really accept the system, but it should be fairer. You know, there's a lot pushing for that. And of course, if it, you know, the Green Party and other people will push for that as a matter of principle. That's just the thing about the votes. The bigger thing I think I'd like us to look at some point, which is kind of fundamental to the whole thing, because for a start, it's right saying, well, you know, the impact we keep saying, oh. In a way, we're almost blaming nationalism, aren't we? But we're blaming it. Oh, it's all that's for. What the fuck can we do to fucking nationalism? You know, it always gets in the way, doesn't it? Which is kind of true. But you know, you'd have to say, well, how come? How come? You know, is it just the propaganda of the bourgeois papers and you know the fact that they got a handle on the education system and so on? You know, I don't know. You could say that's obviously a factor, isn't it? But what are the other appeals? And looking at the appeal most recently, you know, Scotland, and bearing in mind that the Green Party, with its ecological agenda, right, was also pro-Scottish independence and is very keen on, you know, Welsh, more powerful Wales and all the rest of it. And then all those other things I was talking about in Europe, you know, the other movements, Catalonia, you know, all the rest of it, it's all over, isn't it? All over the place, if you like, you know. What are, if you like, the other emotional or even you know, semi-intellectual appeals for this? Because it's always viewed, and we always view, well, nationalism the worst thing sliced bread, so it's seen as a backward-looking thing, right? Because capitalism has been moving forward and pushing all these things together. We got global economy, we've got global economic blocks, and then merging into political blocks. We've got the euro currency replacing separate currency, you know, the whole shift is in all that direction. And beyond that, what is the impact of that on people? Well, the impact of the advancement of capitalism, not just geographically, but in terms of how it alienates and dehumanises everything, how it treats, you know, everything as a commodity, how it makes, well, you know, I mean, you know, when people talk about the McDonaldisation of the world, you know, it does mean something to people because that's what they experience visually. It's a world where everything is being reduced to a sort of a certain sameness. And the few things that people do value, if you like, in their lives are the few differences they have. You know, whether it's language or elements of culture, all sorts of things that might seem unimportant or peripheral in terms of, if you're looking at it in terms of the impact of austerity and cuts and so on. But nonetheless, all these things are kind of important to people. And you can look at that in terms of not, you know, both the birth of capitalism, you know, because the birth of capitalism, if you like, modernised, changed certain things for the better, but it also destroyed lots of things that people wanted, liked, valued in their life as human beings, you know. And I think that's a big problem because, in a way, you know, communists are modernists, in a sense, aren't they? You know, we support, well, dare I go back to Ascendants and Decadents, but, you know, maybe not, you know, I'm not really big on that one, but nonetheless, you know, we've been at the forefront pushing things forward, you know, and in some senses that's put us in alignment with the advance of capitalism, if you like, and there are certain things about it, obviously, which are obviously beneficial. You know, ordinary people would say beneficial. You know, some things in the health service, whereas other things, you know, might think, oh, it's better to an advance. You know, but the other side of it is that for a lot of people, all they see with the advance of capitalism and its globalisation and its extension and basically getting big, not only bigger, but more and more into everyday lives, it's a fucking horrible, you know. And a lot of people, in the context of that, unless they can actually see, which is what we've been saying, they can't actually see a new alternative, a different alternative that goes beyond capitalism, then they start looking back. You know what I mean? And that's where the appeal of small is better, you know, on the ecological side, which not total rubbish, but an element of truth in it, which we could, you know what I mean? So that, and I think it's a hell of a problem. And so I think you know, there's that in it. So that the only reason I'm saying that is to say, well, the way people are being pushed in terms of their feelings and emotions about in reacting to the capitalist modernism, if you like, for a better phrase, is not all backward. It may push them in the wrong direction, but there are things in there that we, in theory at least, we should be able to connect with. You know. Now, just to say the opposite of that, because there is, yeah, I'll try and get this in my last one, because there's something else I read and commented on as well. There are a few people, mainly sort of in the academic, you know, a few people out there, people like Clancy and all that, you know, who do recognise some of the things we recognise, which is that what I was saying earlier, the traditional left's politics, you know, nationalism, that somehow that is a lost cause, it's dead. Even though they regard themselves as left and associate with the left, there's some recognition there somewhere that basically they can't keep regurgitating the old left-wing politics. And so they want to look at something new. And so they're sort of going the other way, but they're quite dangerous in a sense. It's kind of, they've come up with this thing, I don't know if you've heard of it, called the Accelerationist Manifesto, which is to say, oh, well, you know, the left, they're looking backward, then we go backward, they want to stop capitalism progressing and advancing and moving forward. We want to say it's all good. It's like back again. It's like, well, not only is capitalism not degenerate, it's like it's still in this end, and we want to push it to the ultimate, you know, because that is the only way we're really going to bring, you know, I suppose if you like, a crack in the system and a new way of looking at things. I only put that forward because it seems weird, but there are people out there trying to get their heads around the fact that they still see themselves as, you know, if you like, anti-Tory, left, you know, and they linked with, but they're feeling around there somewhere with a way of moving beyond that. But that's got its dangers as well, you know, because what it's, I mean, that is in their case, it's a sort of reaction, if you like, to the other sort of tendencies, some in the anarchist movement elsewhere, which you know, it's like, well, you know, I don't know, the worst of the sort of decentralised, go back to our roots, you know, or, you know, everything can be solved with organic farming and communes, and you know what I mean? It's sort of another version of going backwards, if you like, as they see it. But really, in some ways, a bit scary, because I find the forward march of capitalism pretty scary, frankly. And I think that's the one thing we have in common, but you can't just deal with it in terms of the threat of war or something like that, even though there is a threat of war. You know, there's more to it, I think, in people's feelings about what the fuck is going on in their world, you know, and the loss of control, if you like, in all sorts of different ways. And some of that loss is what they've lost from the past, you know. That's why there are lots of politics around that can sink their teeth into that and tie it, however, to a parochialism or a nationalism or an anti-immigration approach or whatever, you know, or protect our culture, protect our, you know, to the extent, but tie it to the nation and the state, and that is what's backward about it. But not everything, in the terms of people's feelings, is backward necessarily in what's going on in that, you know, swirling of things. I don't know if that makes any sense. But,
lost my thread a bit now. Yes. I was going to say about going back to this EU versus anti-EU thing in regards to left and right. I mean, I don't think it is either a left or right wing thing. It cuts right through all spectrums of the political sort of spectrum, if you like. I was going to add a new dimension now. There's a lot of left groups, including the CPGB and the Trotskyists, support the United Socialist States of Europe. So in other words, I think the idea of international union, if you like, is a good idea, but not on the present supposedly capitalist sort of thing. So they actually advocate an alternative on a socialist sort of basis. If you like, and people like the CPGB, which are in the 90s, don't know where they're at now, but they're essentially the Euro-communist wing of the old CP, who supported this sort of line, and whereas the old school sort of Morning Star sort of wing simply supported withdrawal. And the same sort of goes for the extreme right as well. There's a lot of extreme right, fascists if you like, support a united Europe on the basis of the Third Reich. And of course, I'm not quite sure how to go about it, whether to say smash the whole order up, or say, well, we support a united Europe on our sort of terms. So whether that sort of, these ideas will sort of come to fruition in debate as a possible alternative on these sort of things. But going back to what was said about the Greek government and its claim to, we're doing this on the basis of being elected, that is something surely they've got to say. If they didn't, they'd lose all credit, surely, amongst themselves and their supporters. That is something they're forced to go for, either like it or not. You know, so they're in a situation where they're obviously pro-capital. You know, there's nothing internationalist or working class about it, but obviously a lot of people who support them are obviously potential members of the working class and people who could support real politics. Yes, there is that sort of potential amongst certain people in the movement. But at the moment, you know, it's just a sort of a cross-class of people that are sort of trapped in that support because it's radical. They're offering an alternative to the sort of desperate plight of the old bourgeois parties, seemingly doing that. And of course, not really, but a lot of people turn to them on that sort of basis. So they can't simply sort of, give in to the sort of EU and, renegade on those sort of politics. Which is probably the reason why, wherever possible, certain ideas and people are in opposition, certain people are in power. Like, for example, what would the Tories have done in 2008, when the crash happened? What would they have done? Would they have claimed they didn't support economic intervention? Had they been around, they would either have been forced to go along with it, which means they would risk destroying their credibility, or alternatively, they could have put the whole thing at risk of an economic debacle, total economic freefall. You could say the same about Labour ever since 2010. What would they actually do if they're in government at the moment? Would they actually embrace austerity, which we all know they probably would? If they did that, they'd destroy themselves amongst their supporters. So they can't afford to do it, basically. On the other hand, can they simply put forward into government, like we're saying, return to the Keynesian post-war politics? You can't really. Is there actually an alternative at the moment to austerity? As far as the ruling government's concerned, we're seeing more and more that there isn't. They have to go along with this sort of thing. And it's the sort of dilemma with Greece at the moment. On the one hand, they have to go along with it. So on the other hand, they have to be seen to be trying to put forward some sort of alternative. It would be really interesting. Should the Greek thing, should it collapse and Greece are forced to pull out, what would actually happen? Would that lead to? Could that lead to sort of? Could the fallout actually, lead to more sort of radical ideas and people escaping, sort of net of capitalist politics and sort of moving back towards class struggle? It could be really interesting to see whether that could possibly happen or not. Faced with sort of dead-end alternative.
There's a couple of things I want to come back on, not in any particular order, but one thing is that the comparison between the last election and 1992 was brought up. I think this is pretty apt, as hindsight, however, I do think there is a difference between the current election and the last election and the general election in 1992. I really do think that in 1992 the election delivered the result that the ruling class didn't want. I think I have the feeling that in 1992, I see a shake of a head over there. I think in 1992, in fact, Labour were being groomed to take power. My analysis is that the Tories had run their course, were mired in sleaze, and it was time for a change of management of the state. At that point, the Labour Party was more pro-EU, and the Tories were still racked by divisions on Europe. And I think that the ruling class was preparing for a handover to the Labour Party in '92, which didn't happen. I think the result in some ways was a bit of an accident for the ruling class, that the Tories managed to get themselves re-elected. I don't think it was an accident this time. I think there was, as it's turned out, there were enough predictions from before the election that actually the Tories were going to get a small majority that weren't being reported very well. Seems to me that this may be a part of a deliberate policy of making the election seem closer than it was in order to get more people to come out and vote, to deliberately kind of ramp up the jeopardy involved if it had been released 2 weeks before the election that actually the polls were saying that, some of the polls at least were saying that the Tories were going to get a majority of around 15. Might that have not made some people decide that it wasn't worth the effort of going and voting? I wonder if we've been victims of a bit of management of the news in that case, and that this has been a deliberate policy. Another thing that I want to pick up on is this idea that the SNP put the Tories in. This is quite a big thing, especially among Labour supporters. It may be that fear of the SNP that was whipped up by the press in England particularly, I think, was a spur to getting people to not vote for Labour. But in terms of what happened in Scotland, the SNP did not put the Tories in. Even if every single Scottish seat had gone to the Labour Party, the Tories would still have won a majority at the general election. So in terms of Scotland is completely irrelevant to Labour's failure. Labour lost this general election in England, not in Scotland. Obviously it lost in Scotland. It was hammered in Scotland. But that would have made no difference, even if, as I say, even if every seat in Scotland had been taken by Labour, the Tories would still have an overall majority. So that's a bit of a red herring, or a pale pink herring at least. What else? I've marked a bunch of things here. On why people go for nationalism, I think this idea of a lost sense of community, I think, is very important. Without getting into debates in German between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, it's an important thing that when capitalism modernized, and I think that's a good enough word, production, it destroyed communities, and continues to destroy communities, obviously, but the sort of the 600 years that communities had spent on the land, knowing who their feudal lords were and all the rest of it, and there being at least in theory, a reciprocal relationship between the underlings and their protectors, that was destroyed. You know, the enclosures and the production of a proletariat through people being turfed off the land throws together people from greatly different areas who have different accents and different traditions and different relationships with the place that they're now living, which could be hundreds of miles away from where their ancestors could have lived for generations. So capitalism destroys these communities and then posits new communities for people to belong to. I don't think it's not accidental that the Marxist analysis of the formation of the nation is that the nation state is the creation of capitalism. Obviously we had sort of large entities in the feudal period, but we didn't have nations in the way we understand them now. And I wonder how much people in medieval France considered themselves French, or whether they considered themselves inhabitants of a particular region or whatever. So yeah, I'd agree with Mike that that nationalism is the bourgeoisie's creation of a false community in order to pull the working class into the bourgeoisie's political project. And then in terms of alternatives, well, is there an alternative to austerity for the ruling class? Nick was asking, well, is there an alternative to austerity for the working class? Thought what Kevin was explaining about what happened in Sheffield was really interesting. I've noticed in Leicester over the last 6 months or so that there have been rumblings and some industrial action in hospitals, universities, the fire service, and then of course lately in this last month or so there's been rumblings on the railways as well. And all of these expressions of disquiet about austerity, about cuts to budgets, about speed ups, about layoffs, about worsening of working conditions, all of them have stayed isolated in these little prisons and been managed by management and the unions. The health service workers get called out every couple of months to do a 4-hour demo standing waving placards by the side of a road and getting people to beep if they want a hospital. Quite how beeping is going to make more money for hospitals, or stop staff in the NHS losing their jobs. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, that's the tactic at the moment in Leicester. And 2 weeks later, the fire service will be out burning things outside the fire station, waving banners, go and protect our pensions, and then people in the university, both in academic staff and support staff, are also having discussions about whether or not they're going to go on strike, and the union negotiates strike, and then nothing happens, and the same thing seems to have happened on the railways. So there's anger, there's frustration. Workers seemingly want to do something to challenge what's happening, and yet all of the challenges are pathetic. There's no going beyond tokenism, and we mentioned the demo today. I'm quite sure that there's going to be no going beyond tokenism there either. What's not going to happen is that fire service workers and health service workers and workers in the universities and workers on the railways start talking to each other locally and coordinating their struggles and supporting each other in struggles. And until there's any perspective that can happen, that's even, you know, a real thing that might happen in the real world, then nothing is going to change. Each set of workers is going to be beaten down individually, and the austerity regime is going to continue worsening people's conditions, worsening pay, putting more people on the dole, destroying services, because that's what capitalism needs to do. It needs to make the working class pay for its crisis, and it's doing that quite successfully at the moment. I'm sure George Osborne and the chairpersons of the big banks are all going to bed in the evening satisfied with a job well done. And there is, coming back to this question again, what is the alternative? There doesn't seem to be any alternative that is being posed by the working class as a whole, or the political minorities of the working class, except in a very, very small, isolated, fragmentary way that isn't reaching the vast majority of the people that this message is directed to. So, how do we get over this disconnect between small numbers of people with a biting critique of capitalism? Good God, we're good at critiquing capitalism. But what we're very, very bad at is communicating that critique and in some way connecting with the anger that does seem to be, the anger and disquiet that does seem to be out there, sporadically and in places, or simmering away under the surface and not tapped into. I don't know, I should shut up before I depress myself any further.
Carl this time.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Peter.
No, I want to come back on two short points after, just short ones. But after.
Yeah, I had a couple of snippets, but I'm going to try and cut down on the snippets. Wouldn't mind saying a bit more about nationalism sometime later if we get round to it. Just on what this Nick over here, yeah. Just on what you were saying about basically the extreme right in Britain actually sort of being split on the question of Europe. Yeah, just the sort of, I think you're absolutely right, and there's always essentially been two strands in the sort of fascist right in Britain. The people who were dedicated followers of Mosley by the 60s, 70s, people like Geoffrey Ham, one or two others, who were organising the union movement. Yeah, their slogans are strong Britain and a strong Europe, but that they've largely faded into insignificance by people whose political lineages, the likes of Colin Jordan, John Tyndall, and I mean now you look at the likes of Britain First, whose slogan in the last few months was UKIP at the ballot box, Britain First on the streets, and you know clearly the subtleties of Oswald Mosley, they've lost that over the time. Except I'm sure on the 20th of April every year they go into their dark holes and talk about a strong Europe and who could deliver that. But yeah, there is that division right across the political spectrum, and I think it's right that Marx speculating that parts of the extreme left could build up an ideological position to support the pro-European side on the referendum, and there may be the odd isolated fascist who actually holds to what Uncle Adolf taught them, which is we need a strong Europe. But I think actually I do want to move back into the referendum, and it's actually developing what that Mark said, because I like heresies, and Mark heretically mentioned possibly in 1992 there was an election result which didn't accord with what the bourgeoisie wanted. And I actually think it's quite right. I think it's wrong and simplistic and undialectical to say that there's an executive body of the bourgeoisie who make all the big decisions, and then the rest of the world does as they're told or does as they're duped into. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not sure about the 1992 general election, but clearly at any given time, the bourgeoisie isn't a unified, homogeneous, single entity. It's at the end of the day a collection of rival capitals, even if that's blurred by national boundaries and by converging interests. You know, there's all bourgeoisie isn't a single united entity. So as sometimes someone going to want one thing, someone going to want another, and you know, certainly in that situation, it's a bit meanly to say the bourgeoisie always get what they want, because some of them ain't getting what they want, some of them are. Now, you know, you can measure up the balance of forces in the bourgeoisie. You know, 51% wanted that election result, 49% wanted the other. So, you know, somehow were they cheated, and blow divine no. But I think it's right that, you know, let's not be simplistic and, as I say, I think essentially undialectical. But, and let's get back to referendum, seems pretty obvious, and I think we've all said it one way or another, that the bourgeoisie in Britain, the bourgeoisie in Europe, the bourgeoisie in the USA, and as far as I know, the bourgeoisie in every other metropolitan country, probably excluding Russia, are quite keen that the right result for them is UK stays in the EU. Which actually gives us quite an interesting question, because when you actually look at the lineup of the way this wretched thing's going to happen over the next couple of years, the SNP, and we go into this proportionality thing, because they're Scottish, they actually don't matter for this very much in this referendum. But they're pro-establishment. They can't pretend to be anti-establishment on this one because they want to stay in Europe. So they're pro-mainstream bourgeois on this. Against that, we've got the populist nationalism of UKIP, who actually will, on this occasion, count for a heck of a lot more than the SNP, because all that arithmetic trickery that went on in the general election actually doesn't apply here. One nasty, unpleasant UKIP vote is worth exactly the same as one nasty, unpleasant SNP vote. So when there's 5 times more nasty UKIPers than there are nasty SNPs, when you're having a referendum, that actually shows you can't fudge it by artificially rigging boundaries or gerrymandering anything else. So there's a number of things there which suggest that it's actually going to be closer than the bourgeoisie would like. Because we had a little bit of this conversation at a meeting last week. So by and large, let's take as read that the bourgeoisie gets their own way, by and large, you know, but they don't always get their own way. So what's the actual blinking social basis for this anti-Europe campaign, which is going to be a big campaign? And I think that there's an interesting thing to tease out here, because none of the bourgeois big battalions are supporting it. There's some sort of, and again I think petty bourgeois as a term tends to disguise more than it actually really disguises it more than it describes. There's some sort of, strata of self-made millionaires, the sort of ones you, if you're really unlucky, you bump into the alehouse occasionally, who go around saying, yeah, we're self-made capitalists and we think Nigel Farage is a great guy and have a pint with him and it makes a lot of sense, and we need Britain for the to stand up for itself and punch its weight and all this crap. But that sort of petty bourgeois level, even in classical terms, is never up to much and has to swing behind one class or another. So, I think we are in a position where basically the bourgeoisie clearly want a certain result in this referendum, but they're going to be quite hard pressed to get it. Now, and I think having said that, what the left will then do is say, oh, well, if the bourgeoisie want a plus, then we want a minus, so our instinct is to go on the anti-campaign, although some of them might be more subtle, as this Mark said. Just interesting that there's this major political pantomime that they conjured up, where they actually do, I think, risk getting the wrong answer. I don't think they will. I think they'll get the answer they want, but they're certainly sort of playing with fire on it.
Mike?
Oh, sorry.
Can I just very quickly interject? Just one thing, very quickly. I was just thinking about the referendum thing. I'm thinking the monetary union referendum in Ireland. They held it twice.
Oh, yeah.
First time they lost.
Yeah.
So they redid it again, so they won.
Yeah.
I just thought that was quite
Possibly
interesting.
easier to do in Ireland because it was generally a bit more positive about
Yeah.
it. Being more
We're
of
talking
an
about
outcome
doing it
for
here as well.
But it was just interesting the fact that they got the result they didn't want.
Yes.
So they redid it again and got the
Like
result.
looking fluoride in the water.
Yeah.
Coming for a chair.
Mhm.
Oh no.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm harping on to my favourite subject, but when you said you agreed with me in terms of capitalism reconstituting community through the nation, just to be clear about that, there's two different things associated with that. One is, whilst that is true, that doesn't preclude reconstituting different national divisions, especially if they can be encompassed within a broader framework. So, I mean, for instance, but as with the SNP, a lot of the other smaller nationalist movements within Europe still want to stay. A lot of them want to stay in Europe as well. And some of their agendas are not so different actually from what Cameron's saying. So, there's a lot of scope there. And in terms of managing capitalism and managing the working class and any tentative rebellions within the working class, that's quite a good deal for them, isn't it? Because even in the context of the UK, and I just mentioned the fire service was a good example because quite apart from the unions dividing people up, I mean the FBU is as far as it does have divisions, it's true, in Scotland and here and all that, but it does have a unified grouping. But of course you had a situation where over the pensions and a lot of the other issues, the union did negotiate a deal that wasn't particularly good for the firemen and the firewomen, but they did an early and better deal from their point of view through the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, whilst they were still holding out through the English Parliament, and it was still being debated there. You know what I mean? I don't know that it has ever been resolved. It might have been, but separate, even devolution, even before like total nationalisation, giving these different powers is yet an additional way of sort of helping dividing up the working class. So it's quite obvious, and it's quite a recent example in terms of the fire service. So the fire service in England was out much more regularly and more recently in front of their burning their fires, send fires outside the fire stations in England, but not in Scotland and Wales, or in did I call it Old Scotland? No, Northern Ireland, whatever. Anyway, as well. So that's the point. But just the point I made about capitalist reconstitution of the community. The other thing is not only can it reconstitute nationalism itself, it can reconfigure it, which is what I was talking about, but it also reconstitutes community, as that's often understood especially in more sort of local context, in other ways. I mean, if you like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, I suppose a good example would be the weakening of traditional religions as the focus of community relations in many areas. But there's a shift, if you like, to replacing those with, well, essentially commercial or semi-commercial forms of people being able to form, social relationships and human relationships with each other in some kind of vague sense. Lots of, I don't know, all sorts of clubs and things that appear online that involve, payment of your regular club fee and all the rest of it. And even the ones that have been started off as sort of voluntary things eventually get taken over and incorporated into some new commercial venture. But it's a very simple example, but it's going to happen in a much more deeper level. It's like when the parents take the group of kids, where do they go for their party? They go to fucking McDonald's, they don't organise. Well, there's all this stuff. I mean, these are not very good examples maybe, because it's at a much deeper level really, but I'm trying to think of little easy things that people will be, well, and even things like, kids' parties, I mean, there was a thing just recently saying, well, we're going to have a kids' party now. Well, I'm sure this is a middle class thing, but nonetheless, middle class, well, you have to, it's like a really big thing. Got to buy presents for all the kids, commercial, commodity thing, and if you bought presents for lot of kids at that party, then when they have a party, they've got to do the same thing. It's whole commercialisation of just everyday things that were, done normally. Or you have to get a fucking clown in. A clown. Shit, scary stuff. They have to, pay for a clown to come in and entertain the kids. These are just tiny little examples, but if you add them all together, all these things together, capitalism is reconstituting communities in its own image, in the image of value and the commodity and everything else. So it's not just, it's not just the more obvious, if you like, state aspect of it and political aspect of it. There's also the economic and commercial aspect of it as well. And it's really, really difficult. But the only good thing is, I said, people do respond to that sometimes. They do fight back against it. They do, try and organise other things in a non-commercial way, and all of which should be encouraged. But I don't know how far that goes.
Let me just reconstitute what you're saying in a different way. So the mums who don't want to take their kids to McDonald's for a party, or they don't want to buy their bread from some specific supermarket, they bake their own bread. So they have this whole thing where they have to buy the machine and they have to buy special flour. So it's all just going round and round in this kind of
expensive commodity.
Mine makes great bread.
They usually make the bread twice, mind you, and then they get stuff in the corner, but that's another matter. But I know exactly what you mean.
But I mean, just the thing that often pops into my head of talking around stuff like this is the way the situationists use the word recuperation. Now, ICC uses slightly differently, but just the capacity of the system to recuperate activity. Scary. Yeah.
But what's posed as an alternative also does that. So this whole thing about DIY culture is just another treadmill, but it's like it poses itself as some sort of alternative to the real treadmill.
There's 4 of us down still to speak now, but it's almost 4 o'clock. Should we have a break first? 10 minutes.
It's out to sleep at the moment.
Me, 2 marks, yourself.
Oh, I've spoken. I did my bit just now.
I just want to make,
I
I
think
think
we should have a break.
Yes.
Does anybody still smoke?
Yes.
That's not
One out, all out.
Well, we're going to get some beer, isn't it?
On the subject of reconstituting the working class
Yeah.
into false communities,
That's right.
they've got on football.
Yeah, non-league football is a great recuperative
There's
factor.
nothing false about that community. It might not be in the right place, but it's a very real community.
Right, I've got me, then Mark and Nick down from before. No? No? Sure.
I might use mine. To be honest.
I'll give you the opportunity. I'm quite happy to do that. Yeah, I was just going to start with a couple of quick points. I was quite interested with what Mike was saying about this sort of looking back. The fact that nobody had any real sort of measures for the future meant that sort of policies were not quite reactionary, but harking back to things that have gone in the past. And I can certainly see that with the sort of right wing. It's been a mainstream part of conservatism and the right wing argument for a few decades now. Has been this idea that the high point of the economy was back in the 19th century, when there was no real state involved and it was private industry and so forth, and that's the basis of their arguments nowadays. I wondered if, when you're coming back, Mike, how you saw that in terms of the left, though. I mean, is it the same thing? I think you mentioned the left, but I didn't pick up on what you were saying there. But what's the response of the left at the moment? How are they? Are they looking back to particular periods for their current policies? Because what we see, we talked about it, haven't we, the sort of continual redrafting of left unity because they're being unsuccessful. So that seems to be going on. But I wondered if could say anything about the tendency, the direction that their politics are going in or moving in. And another point on the strength of the bourgeoisie at the moment, and the control that's exerted over the working class, certainly in Britain. There are various things that strike me as being particularly important. The nationalism one is a key. Again, for the last few decades, this sort of nationalism has been used very strongly to, both in terms of a campaign and the sort of reconstitution of sort of community idea that has been happening as well. But there's been clear campaigns to develop and sort of align people with sort of nationalist viewpoints, Britain and so forth. But also, it's not just that, but that there are really the ideas that strikes are wrong, that strikes hurt workers, not just yourself, the ones that go on strike, but it also hurts other workers. That strikes they're illegal anyway, but they don't really help the situation, they just hurt anybody. That all improvements in living standards, wage improvements must be earned, for example. These are really strong sort of concepts at the moment. They really are used quite powerfully. So it's to the extent that everybody nowadays seems to accept that austerity is the norm, that's right, and that you can't get any improvements unless you actually give a lot more to the firm in efficiency terms and hours and working practice and so forth. And I think those elements are really strong parts of bourgeoisie's control at the present time. Okay, Mark? No? Yes?
No, I'll leave it.
Mark?
Before we had a break, one of the things that Kevin asked was, what's the basis of the anti-EU campaign in the ruling class? Now, Kevin might not like the notion of the petty bourgeoisie. I think there's a certain mileage in it. I think that in the idea that on the whole, the big bourgeoisie wants the European Union and wants Britain to be part of the Union. And there is a section of the bourgeoisie that doesn't want Britain to be part of the EU, and I think I think it doesn't entirely tally up, but I think that the support for that notion is quite strong in the petty bourgeoisie, and because I do think the petty bourgeoisie is a real thing. But it's not just, I suppose, in the petty bourgeoisie, but it seems to me that the international companies, like international entities, it's easier to have common standards across Europe if that means that companies don't have to change their products to sell them in lots of different territories. If you can sell this, if you're operating in multiple territories, then it makes sense if those territories have common standards, so you can produce one set of products and sell them everywhere. The companies, and therefore the bourgeois, the representatives of the bourgeoisie that are associated with those companies that are more likely to be locally nationalist, I think, are those that operate on a local basis. So if you only operate in a region of your own country, then maybe you're not that bothered about whether or not you have common standards with France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Greece, because it doesn't matter to you. You're quite happy maybe to take the fact that Polish and Romanian workers can come over and be hideously exploited. But on the whole, projects like the EU are possibly seen as over-bureaucratic and therefore overly restrictive to what people are doing at the local level, and therefore the social basis for the anti-EU campaign, it would seem to me, is in that section of the less successful, if you like, section of the bourgeoisie that doesn't necessarily trade internationally. And it seems to me, at least, that that's a fairly reasonable way of drawing the fracture lines inside the bourgeoisie between the sort of what Mike was talking about earlier, the sort of globalizing drive on the one hand, and this idea that locality and regionality and smaller units might actually have some meaning there. Mike was talking about it in terms of meaning, kind of psychological meaning in people's lives, but I think there's an element of the capitalist class for which that has meaning as well, that they don't necessarily need to go and export their products throughout all over the world, as long as they can get a corner of the globe and go, right, well, we're going to really intensively exploit this bit. That's maybe enough for some capitalists who don't then therefore need big supranational entities like the EU. So it's not entirely the same as the petty bourgeoisie, but it's not entirely different either, I think. Not that I would go, oh, because there is a petty bourgeoisie, then what we have to do is exploit these differences between the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, because I think, I'm not a Stalinist, so I don't see any reason why I should. Because it seems to me that that's precisely what Stalinism did for quite a long time, and still has a certain basis in that. I keep talking about what the left is going to do about the referendum, and there are still some groups that are related to the old Stalinist parties, I think, that are mostly going to be anti-EU in the referendum, and obviously the CPB is one of them. And also, if the SLP manages to survive that long, I think the SLP is going to be anti-EU. But even the SPEW is anti-EU. They're heavily involved in the whole Tusk thing, which came out of the No to EU thing a few years ago. So yeah, the SPEW is, probably now the biggest Trotskyist organisation in Britain after the implosion and whatever else happened with the SWP. But the SPEW is probably the biggest in Britain, and that's also anti-EU. And just to me, that's a demonstration that neither the pro-EU nor the anti-EU lobbies have anything to offer the working class. The question is not whether Britain should be outside or inside of the EU. The question is whether the working class can up its game to the point where Britain and the EU and all of the other capitalist entities are put into jeopardy. Obviously it can't at the moment, but that doesn't mean that the working class has any interest in fighting over how capitalism arranges itself. I should leave it there.
All right, yeah. I was going to make some points which have been answered by the last few speakers actually. I was going to come back on the need for workers to actually get together directly and organise their own struggle as opposed to being sort of divided by the unions, organising pathetic one-day demonstrations and by the fire workers and hospital workers and all that. Yes, I think the cultural problems are a very big sort of one. Mike and Richard were making earlier on about the need for people to buy presents and keep up with the Joneses and that sort of the way capitalism sort of got people into that sort of mode of thinking. That's sort of very important sort of thing. And there's also the part that when people aren't so much about it political, but relate more to sort of everyday life is being talked about. And they get a much better response. So that's one of the sort of things that came up. And I was just sort of going back to obviously everybody in this room supports the need for direct sort of working class organisation outside the unions, effective sort of action if you like. The sort of question I was going to ask is why is it so difficult for this to happen? Why is it simply down to the organisations and revolutionary minorities to sort of get all the failures to get their act together? No, I don't think it's that simple, to be honest. I think a lot of people overestimate their own importance and they don't actually understand why it's this. I don't claim to have any magic solutions, or I certainly don't consider myself more in the know. I'm just thinking this is a sort of problem. It's not simply the lack of this organisation or the fact we're just too small. I think the problem's a lot deeper than that. Well, lots of it's outside of our sort of control, the sort of cultural things that are going on, developments in capitalism, the way it's broken down communities, the way it's sort of, taken society over the last few decades, sort of breakdown of workplaces, there's all those sorts of things. And at the same time, there's obviously a vacuum, wider support for UKIP. We were saying outside in the break, it's not because people support nationalism, or because people support the Great British Empire or anything, or even because they want to come out to Europe. By and large, it's because people are simply looking for an alternative. It's a party that embraces sort of one or two vague populist ideas. So white people got nothing better to do than support people like UKIP. But the fact they are doing so, indicates there is a sort of vacuum, there is a sort of discontent, and there is obviously anger there, as I pointed out earlier on. There's obviously anger there which can be tapped and it has got potential. But there's people like this person I'm with at the moment who's risking getting kicked out of a council flat. She's got all sorts of these sort of ideas coming up. The council after the housing for council tax and God knows what. And she'll agree with all the sort of things I'm saying, but she won't, his politics, embrace politics in any way whatsoever. So again, that's sort of a dimension which sort of came up. But there's all sorts of things. Is it simply the case that what Marx once said, the ruling ideas of each epoch are the ideas of the ruling class? Is it that, or is the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the sort of way people think about communism, is that still a factor? Has it all come down to the fact that people it was said, you know, a few minutes ago, austerity has become the norm. It seemed in many people's eyes, not conscious capitalists, the capitalists with a small c, or conservatives with a small c, people just don't see any sort of alternative, you know, to capitalism or present day society as it happens at the moment. And there's what Phil was saying about strikes, you know, that can be turned on the head as well. You know, it's all counterproductive, harms people, you know, all this sort of thing. So I don't really know whether we've got the answer, but it's simply not down to, you know, the revolutionary organisations being too small or not being up to the job or whatever. I don't think it's that simple. There's a danger of us, at least some people, overestimating their own importance. I'll leave it there.
Anybody else? I'll be next. I'll be down anyway at the moment.
Can we follow on from what Nick's saying?
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, to some extent, it's sort of underscores or is to one side, but very relevant to everything else that we talked about. Why is it so difficult to for communists to successfully, well, I don't know, lots of people here wouldn't use the word communist, but whatever we want to call ourselves, how difficult is it? Why is it so difficult for those who believe in proletarian revolution to find much of an impact in the class today? Because I think we all share an understanding that the class still exists, and the class has the historic role of reconstituting society and laying the basis for a real, genuine future humanity. And we accept that we're a tiny minority. And I think we get back to the question of class consciousness, of the fact that somehow there's a position where the working class has to move on from being aware of its own existence to a position where it actually becomes aware of its political potential to recreate society in its own image. And I think we've actually, lots of the people here, lots of the organisations which we relate to, sort of really have about 40-45 years sort of existence. We can say, well, you know, things we're really involved with came out of the ferment at the end of the 60s and then in the 70s and so on. But when that ferment was taking place, there was still an identifiable, in the areas where we all live, there was an identifiable working class culture which still had its roots around large scale production, still had its roots around working class communities which were linked much more directly to the productive process, much more directly to the workplace, much more directly to shared experience in the way there are labour powers alienated. And over 40 years, it seems to me that it's pretty clear that capitalism has altered the way that the working class is organised in places like this, and that class identity has slipped back even from the awareness of us being a class in ourselves, and that has become dissolved over the last half century, and that's one of the challenges we've got. How do we turn it around? And this is weird because I was personally involved, somehow I end up always feel that somehow this is very imperfect and I must have done things wrong and things were incorrect. But I'm going to challenge this a little bit. This wretched town, Stocksbridge, where I happen to live, council turns up and says, right, you people have got a sports centre there. It's been there about 40 years. We know that your parents and your grandparents helped build it by public subscription, by going on, knocking on doors, collecting pennies, collecting shillings. But actually it no longer suits the council's needs and we're going to demolish it. And the way we, and I use that word advisedly because I think it was the people in the area, and we are all working class, because none of us are bourgeois. I've checked your house, I've checked whether anyone wears top hats or owns the local mill, and we're definitely all proletarian, because that's what happened. And we said, no, we don't want this to happen. And those of us with a bit more awareness said, right, okay, in that case, we're going to have mass meetings, we're going to set up a committee which is answerable to the mass meetings, and the people of the town are going to turn up in their hundreds, which they did, and we're going to see where we can take this. And we stopped the council demolishing it, and I'm convinced part of the reason why we successfully stopped it was because the committee always made it clear that it was answerable to the mass meetings. And that the fact that the building is still there is evidence of that victory. But of course, the struggle becomes recouped. And I think there's two elements of the recuperation. One is the building's still there, but it's now run as a not-for-profit business by a not-for-profit collective organisation, which I personally backed away from because that's not my role. My role is to take on capital when it's attacking, fight it back, and then once it's recuperated, what can you do? Nothing against them, and they're all doing a grand job, but it's not my role to run not-for-profit organisations. But the other thing is, and you know, in a way, this is the frustrating bit, is that in my view, that was a local assembly. In my view, that was the way local working class communities need to defend themselves. But the working class people who were part of that campaign actually haven't drawn the lessons that this is how the working class resists austerity, resists the assaults. Lots of them support UKIP now because UKIP weren't the Labour council who was shafting them, and UKIP stand candidates in elections, and oh boy, Stocksbridge only didn't have these nasty Labourists thrashing us, things would be better. Whereas I say to them, no, actually what really happened was, without being fully conscious of it, and this is the key thing, we organised ourselves and we took it on, and we had mass meetings to control things. Once it was clear that it wasn't going to be demolished, once it was into how can it be saved within capitalism, then the mass meetings took a deliberate decision, and I argued for it, and I actually encouraged them to take the decision that we actually dissolve the mass meetings, because mass meetings were actually an organ of struggle, which now was no longer appropriate. The thing had moved on. We'd actually won that struggle, but the lesson isn't learnt, and the reason okay, perhaps I'm a crap communist, but the more underlying reason why the lesson isn't learnt is because 40 years before, that town was still based around a steelwork, it was based around shared experience, it was based around shared working together even to build that wretched place, whereas now people are atomised, they work in different ways, they haven't got that sense of working community. There's some sort of broad concept of community because we all live in the same place, but that development of class consciousness hasn't you know, isn't evidence. You know, somewhere there might be odd seeds here and there, and individuals who I talk to you can work on. But you know, there's nothing there which says, goodness me, the working class can actually resist attacks by organising itself. And the lesson is that we need a worldwide community based on workers' councils. We ain't got there. Which I think is probably just an example of how frustrating the world is.
Mark, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
I mean, you may have written it. I can't remember. I remember a little bit, maybe in your paper about it. I can't remember, but. Your organisation, or some of your people, came from the old Solidarity group, you know, and so, as I did for a period of time, you know, and moved on, definitely. But in terms of methodology, if you like, strategies, one of the things I always thought it did very useful is where it was involved in a struggle of that kind, it would produce a very specific little pamphlet or something just about that, which it would make big efforts in to distribute more widely to the people involved in the widely. And I still think that is worthwhile in some cases, because there's a difference between that and what Solidarity also did, and what papers like this or you do, is to incorporate it in a more political regular journal. Yeah, which has its place, because we do want to draw the connections between other things, and which is part of the propaganda exercise of a political paper. But in terms of just you know, getting some input or even feedback from particular struggles, it does seem that I always thought there was a benefit. One of the better things that Solidarity did was to be able to focus, you know, on a specific thing, draw all the lessons, you know, actually get. Preferably, you know, to talk to other, not just the one or two people that might have been, say, in Solidarity or friends of Solidarity, but to get, you know, interview people, get different people's reactions, why people didn't think it worked, why, you know what I mean? And then do all that, and then put it back into that, quote, community or whatever, you know. And these things don't happen very often, but I mean, there are little successes. You're right to emphasise in a way, because there are little successes like that still going on. They're very small and tend to be localised. And yes, that is our problem, is that, you know, even when there are successes, they tend to be very isolated things, and we don't draw together. So that, obviously, we have a role politically in trying to do that, but it doesn't deny the other, just a little bit of practical work, really. You know what I mean? And there is a little bit of that goes on, and with sort of feedback with some of the local things. You know, I mentioned my comrade in Edinburgh, who, you know, we had that issue about. But I mean, they do like a little local paper that just does deal with local struggles, where they failed, where they didn't fail, and tries to do things, you know. And I think there is still a role for that kind of thing, where we live. I don't work anymore. But
can I just come back?
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, Mike. And I think in terms of not having produced a written document like that was a failing. Because I have to say, when we did the Beeline article on the website about it, within, and it's because some of the people I knew actually picked up on it, and they advised people, come and have a look at this. We got an enormous amount of hits on that article, which again was good, and there were people, a couple of people commented on it, and people always use me who've done it, and it actually split off some of the UKippers who were then sort of related at the time, became extremely nasty with me and said, you're trying to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I'm saying no, it's actually the fact that this was a working class movement, whether you were in it or not, and you might not like it, but you've been part of the class defending itself. And that quite upset them.
No, it's good. to getting people like that away.
Yeah, no, we do. We had an enormous amount of hits on when it went up, and it was because of the local stuff.
Mark.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that there's going to be a bit of a swerve, I'm afraid, about political minorities and revolutionary organisations, and whether or not the problem is that the revolutionary organisations are too small. Revolutionary organisations are too small. I don't think we can. I don't think there's a counter argument to be put there. It would be better if there were more people who had a revolutionary critique of capitalism, and those people were trying to talk to each other and work together. I can't see how that would not be better than what we have. I don't think the problem is that the revolutionary organisations have an inflated idea of their own importance. People in this room may disagree with that statement. People in this room may have certain organisations in mind when they disagree with that statement. But I don't think the problem is that the revolutionary organisations that exist have an inflated idea of their own importance. I would rather see it as the revolutionary organisations that exist don't have, if they have anything, I think it's that they don't have enough ambition maybe they're very conscious of their own small size and their own lack of resources and their own inability to intervene effectively, and as I was saying earlier, God, we're good at critiquing capitalism, but if nobody's listening, then how useful is that? How useful is that critique? I'm hoping that, I'm not going to claim that we should have a left communist mass party or anything ridiculous like that, but I don't see that the problem. I don't see that one problem cannot be that revolutionary minorities are tiny, and therefore not as effective as they could be. It's not just about numbers, but numbers come into it. A lot of things are outside our control. Yeah, fine. What about the things that aren't outside our control? The ICC talks about political organisations and political minorities being an active factor in the generalisation of class consciousness. Well, okay, the political organisations are an active factor in the generalisation of class consciousness. You can disagree.
I just coughed, that's all.
That's all. I took it as a cough of disagreement. But if they're only a tiny factor, then the amount of class consciousness they can help to generalise must of necessity be very small. I don't know. I don't know. It's the political responsibility of revolutionary organisations to try and intervene, to try and help the working class come to an understanding of its historic role. And while I'm sure that members of political organisations take this very seriously, the current situation is one in which none of the political organisations of the working class are very good at that. And we're sitting here with members of the CWO, and I think the CWO are about the best there is at actually trying to communicate.
Is this still being recorded?
It is, yeah.
We haven't got to the part yet.
No, there isn't a but.
Oh,
I think the CWO does.
I'm actually just going to put that bit on Facebook, just a little bit.
Extract that.
Nice people, the CWO. Lovely people.
But with the best will in the world, a very small organisation, and with not great capacity for intervening in things that are happening. So I know this is getting a bit away from the stated topic of the meeting, but I think there are really only two things that revolutionaries need to discuss, and that's where are we at and what do we do. And we've talked about where we're at for a bit. I want to go on to what do we do for a bit, even though it's not the topic of the meeting. How do we make our intervention into things that might be going on, or into just the life of the class more generally, how do we make that more effective? Because at the moment we're not very effective. And as I said, I think the fact that CWO produces Aurora and it tries to go to lots of meetings, the fact that you're here today to discuss you're trying, you're doing things, yes, but how effective is that? How can we all be?
Sorry. No, you introduced the but.
Oh, okay. that was the but.
Yeah, so I just wanted hesitating. Clearly, we will be bigger when you join us.
That's always John's answer as well. Yeah. How do we? That wasn't a yes. That was an agreement that would be the organisation's question in return. So how do the revolutionary minorities of the working class, who surely all take their political responsibility seriously, how do we intervene more effectively in struggles? How do we intervene more effectively in the working class's response to austerity? How do we intervene more generally in the life of the working class to just try and mitigate or work against some of the shit? That's the question put most boldly, I suppose.
Nick,
Excuse me a second.
Right, well that's...
we've got rid of you now.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I'll just go away and sulk. But size isn't everything.
It's what you do with it that counts.
Exactly.
To take up Mark's question, I think there's one thing we definitely shouldn't be doing, which we are, which is stuck in the late 19th century with archaic language, not archaic ideas, but we're portraying ideas in archaic ways which mean absolutely nothing to anybody. You're saying how Auroras are the best, organs of communication.
The fact that the producer is good.
No, but just look at it, right? There's words like, hardly anybody would make any sense of this at all, bearing in mind where people's mindsets and education and that is. Class means, sort of variable capital and, class in abstract sort of ways and, technically I think this is good and what it's saying is great, but it'll mean nothing to most people. Absolutely nothing. They'd give up after, the third paragraph. If you said exactly the same thing to them in the vernacular, right, they'd say, yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of it. Yeah, you've got a point, and it gets them thinking, and then they'll engage with you. Now, I think potentially out there, there's still a vast body of people, right, we can reach that instinctively, you know, would begin to turn towards work-class politics and see something in it. But it's got to be, you know, portrayed in a way they can even begin to grapple with. And other things like Phil was saying about, you know, there's a downer on strikes now and people say, oh, but strikes aren't possible because of this, that and the other. Well, we tend to dismiss that because, well, in our historical tradition and looking back, yes, strikes are a great weapon. But if we actually stop and think, right, in this country, in the here and now, in a lot of work, you know, strike isn't a sensible option. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, strikes don't play a role anymore or anything, but it does make me think, right, what we should be thinking is, you know, what other, you know, think outside the box. There's nothing in Marxism that says, oh, you can't think of a new tactic or, you know, some other way of dealing with something and all the rest of it. But whenever you try and do that, people sort of entrench and they'll start muttering about, oh, he's starting to be a bit of a revisionist or this, that. You know, for goodness sake, you know. I just think, you know, it's not just because we're small, because I think actually, small as we are, we could begin to get through to people and think, you know, I think you'd be surprised how quickly things can change. You know, I'll not say we'll suddenly within 2 years have a mass movement or something, but I think we're in a ghetto of our own making and we're not thinking outside the box, if you like, of, you know, what to do about it. I could say those more things, but I won't at this point.
I think the question of size is perhaps the wrong way to approach the question of how we intervene, what we do, etc. I think outside of periods of a revolutionary upsurge, or at least a significant amount of class struggle, revolutionary organisations are always going to be pretty small. Yes, they could be bigger, but they're always going to be pretty small. I think the period of the mass party is long gone, so I don't think we should avoid what we've talked about, talked about this afternoon, what the right and the left do. Is this sort of theme of nostalgia that runs through their ideas. They're either trying to remember a world that never was, or imagine a world that never will be within capitalism. You know, this idea that.
Have you been thinking about that for?
But the point about revolutionary organisations are that they need to. Well, there's two diameters. There's whether you intervene all the time, whether you lock yourself away and you engage in deep reflection. My suggestion would be there's a need to do both, and I think when Kevin was talking about his experiences in his hometown, it made me think about some of the groups that are engaging in workers' inquiry, so things like Angry Workers of the World and things like that, where on a very small scale and in a very modest way, they're trying to intervene in workplaces and draw out lessons and reflect on their experiences within those struggles. And I think perhaps that's potentially more useful than this idea of trying to build the party. I'm not sure. Maybe I misunderstood what some of the others have said, but I think there's some mileage in that activity. But I would agree in general sense that all of the existing revolutionary groups. I mean, who are we talking about? I mean, there are some groups who we would say defend revolutionary. Well, most of us wouldn't. Most of us would say that they defend a communist perspective, and they are never going to change. Bordegists are never going to realise the dead end that they're in. They're never going to come out of that. They're never going to come out of the room and say hello to the world. They're always going to be locked away. So
at some point the world might say hello to them.
The world, their room is so far away from everyone else. The world's they're not going to worry about it. But I think all I'm trying to say is this idea about size is a bit of a dead end. It's more about activity, about not just activity, but about how we're analysing and reflecting on the situation, how we understand it, and also, ultimately, it doesn't matter what we do; it's what the class does, and that's the most important factor for me. It's what if the class needs to, as Kevin said, rediscover itself as a class for itself and all that sort of stuff. And until it does that, revolutionary organisations are always going to be a minority. And that's what makes it so hard for them to do all the things that they need to do.
I think Mike, did you see
No.
Mike's before me?
Yes, that's
Yes,
true.
you knew that.
Yes, I know that. That's all right. I've got you down there, Mark. Don't worry.
I'll come back on some of this.
Yeah, and me. Yeah, I'll agree with what Mark was saying before, in that we've had a discussion about the situation now, the current situation, and in doing that, I think you then do move on to what should be our practice now. I think that's a logical step to be taking, and it's all these problems. The problems of the discussion, the fact that there's lots of disparate little issues to be and threads to be taken up, but they don't cohere. There's nothing in our faces that say this is what we should be doing. That's part of that situation now. I don't think we should be bashing our heads against the wall and sort of regretting that we've not been more efficient and effective and things like that, because I do think that Richard said it's what the class does that matters, and it's quite clear that for the last 2 or 3 decades there's been a regression of struggle, there's been a downturn in struggle, there's a little going on, and the revolutionary organisations become smaller or less effective. I don't think you can sort of fight against that. There's, like Nick said, there's various things I could see that I'd like to improve, the language being one of them as well. I'd rather see, we were talking beforehand about effectiveness of going to football matches and concerts and sort of selling things there rather than at leftist meetings, weren't we? Things like that. I'd rather see newspapers that were full of smaller bits and pieces rather than the big theoretical articles, because even though they're meant to be practical, because they're so long, they become just too much to grasp. I'd rather see lots of bits and pieces. We've got ideas like that, but I don't think that's fundamentally going to change the situation, that it's a period of downturn and you're fighting against the stream. You're discussing what's going on, you're trying to understand what's going on, but you're not going to change the balance of power, I suppose, in society as a whole. It's when the class moves that's the issue. And I've sort of understand it as being more and more important over the years. The way we try and understand the current situation and discuss it and discuss what's going on is actually a very important role. We're using the theoretical background to understand what's going on nowadays, and that might not matter now, but it will do at key points in history, and that's what we're doing, I think, when we're having these discussions, however that plays out. So what should be the practice now in a downturn? Yes, do we lock ourselves away in a room and
He said
think
as
deeply?
well locked away in the room. Discussing deeply.
So Somebody's
Well-
keeps turning the temperature up. Trying to cook us.
I mean, Mark and I have had a little sort of bash at the ICC and their sort of current approach to things, haven't we, Mark? I loved your comment. Sorry, I'll repeat it for the tape recorder about the International Communist Discussion Group thing that you were saying. Well, you didn't use that expression, but you were saying what's the difference between the ICC and a discussion group? Given their,
If they're not,
given
if
their
they're not
approach.
intervening in
Yes,
things.
yeah, that's right. So they've taken one approach which I don't particularly agree with. And again, I'd agree that sort of the CWO has continued in the same. I'm assuming it's continued in the same mold. Perhaps Kevin can sort of perhaps give some insight into how CWO sees its practice there. I'd like to ask that actually, and how you respond to the situation. I mean, I don't tend to feel that sort of nowadays things are quiet. It ought to be a time where militants are getting together and discussing with each other and understanding each other as well as that situation, rather than just slagging each other off or not talking to each other and things like that. Whatever the disagreements, there ought to be more discussion, and I think that's my view of sort of CWO and ICC relations. Sorry to put you on the spot, Kevin, but whether you've got any view of how the CWO, I mean, not so much, not to pin you down about the ICC, but CWO perspectives for its activity, how it views its activity. But it's Mark next.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on your point. Yeah, just to come back on the old written thing, because I mean every organisation I've been in has always had this interest. It's always an interesting discussion. One of the things I think generally tends to happen with the honours when they are small, very small, they do tend to. It tends to be more about content and who you're actually going to be giving out your information to. I mean, Aurora in its present state is not going to be handed out around council estates. It's not produced. The Free Communist was never intended to be handed out around council. It was always aimed at a very specific audience. People who would political. But people who effectively are already political, in one way or another. I think clearly how you word something. If there's a strike, apparently there's a bakery strike at the moment going off somewhere near Drumfield, just north of Chesterfield. And if you're going to intervene in something like that, it would be very differently worded. You'd word it extremely differently than what.
Hopefully,
but you would hope to keep the same content as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what you don't want to do. I mean, you think groups like Class Warriors' content, actual political content, just went down to nothing in order to get the message across to the lowest denominator. And you get that often with the left of capital, the Trotskyist left, who often put things down so low down that it kind of loses its actual content, its political content.
Jump in, sorry, briefly, but the one thing about the SPG that does quite impress me is that they manage to write things in a very clear tone, even when they're talking about
sometimes
regional social high.
not always.
Not always.
Some of that stuff is quite difficult to read, to be honest.
But I've been quite impressed at times.
Well, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, it's Mark. Carry on, Mark. We'll all do it.
I've kind of done anyway. I'm done. I just wanted to make that point.
Okay. Then,
that I think as organisations get, let me just go on a sec then. As organisations get bigger, generally the type of, I mean, when I was in the ACF back in the early 90s, well, 93 onwards, the content that we produced then was different from what AFED produces today, partially because of doubling the size of the organisation, so therefore it becomes more generalised. It has more, the language changes quite a bit. But even then, I mean, even in AFED, our conference a few years ago in Manchester, and there were even complaints then about the content of Organise, that it was still too intellectual, even the content of Resistance, which is basically just a small news sheet, was criticised for having too many big words and stuff in. So,
No, it's not about being intellectual or big words, but it's words that still have meaning for people. Like, look, I'll just give an example of what I mean. And this is good, I've got no problem with what it's saying, but, so...
I mean, I wasn't just talking about that, I was talking about the whole plethora of stuff as well.
Good
Yeah.
idea. I mean, this isn't big words or particularly intellectual, right? Oh, bear with me just 1 minute.
You should use the pink pen on things like big pink mark.
About we need communism. Right, yeah, here we are.
Should we carry on, Wallace? We know what you mean.
Right, we're talking about...
What about the
I mean,
time?
it talks about, right, the class fighting back, and it needs to be a conscious fight. This starts with a communist and not a state capitalist programme. Well, most people haven't got a fucking clue what communism means, and that's for state capitalism. Well, what the hell is that? Now, okay, if you're fairly old, oh yeah, communism, oh yeah, that was something to do with Soviet Union, was it, and Poland or something? If you're of later generation, you ain't got a bloody clue. Absolutely none. And most, you know, and that's not big words or intellectual, but there are other ways of putting that to my mind. You know,
I kind of agree
which
in
people
one sense,
would actually,
but as I said before,
if you use words that aren't you know, regularly used in the English language anymore, which they're not,
It's more like
except in our circles, it's absolutely and totally irrelevant and meaningless.
Mike?
Yeah, I want to strike it away from language again, to be honest. You see, I think what you said, and to some extent what you said, is correct, but it's only correct. I mean, first thing to say is it's really only correct for parts of the world. You know, communists, we are supposedly, you know, against capitalism, which is a world system. We have international links, we have a world view, we see class struggle as being international and cross, you know, transnational, if you like, in many ways. There's huge levels of class struggle going on around the world, so it isn't the case, you know. So we just need to be clear about that and distinguish what we're saying at any point, because the discussion today was meant to concentrate in terms of the UK and possibly Europe. Though even in terms of Europe, there's been plenty of class struggle going on. You know, you might not like everything about it. Maybe it's got weaknesses, all sorts of problems, but not that nothing's been going on. There's been no significant levels of struggle. So that's the first point. So what we say about that, you know, what Kevin, isn't it, said? Keith. Sorry, Kevin. Keith said about the changes that took place in Stockbridge, wasn't it? You know, about how there was a potential there. Am I getting the right places? I'm sorry I get the names mixed up.
I think he's playing games.
Yeah,
I think he's calm now.
No, there's an important point here, because what you talked about was you was talking about a situation where there's a local geographical area where people are working class, but where the nature of the working class and its history has changed. So for us, in many of the places we actually live in this country, in situations where we think we might, one way or another, as people, individuals or groups of individuals, actually intervene or affect something, we're talking about that situation. We're not talking necessarily, might be in our paper, you know, our political papers, look at analysing the situation in the world and what's happening in Greece and how that's going to affect. Yeah, fine, you know. That's at one level. That's what a political paper does. That isn't just UK orientated, but is part of the world communist movement, for want of movement, won't call it that. Anyway, political movement, for want of a better phrase. That's what that does. But the situation we're faced with on a day-to-day level is more restricted because of the changes that you've been talking about. Now, if that is the case, you have to reflect on what that means we can do in those situations, because really you're talking about, I think you actually used the word, something along the lines of, in some ways we have to start from scratch, or we have to start again, you know, because that class identity has been broken down, you know, and it doesn't exist, and therefore we're starting from a lower level of understanding or awareness or identity or whatever, you know. Now, if that's true, it seems what we do as an organisation has got different levels, you know, and it may be that there are different organisations for doing that, which is a question. Now, what I'm going to say is, not something I say, but the Solidarity Federation, right, anarcho-syndicalist, it took quite clear decision. It analysed that situation for it in this country, and it took a quite clear decision, it seems to me. It stopped publishing its political journal. It stopped writing loads of stuff about, well, except for the odd article on Libcon, but generally speaking, as an organisation, it stopped writing more general political stuff, talking about women's liberation, feminism, all sorts of, you know, ecology and all these other things that we're all interested in. But it stopped doing all that. It said, right, well, from now on, we're not going to do any of that. Forget the title anarcho-syndicalist, because I've had my arguments with them about that. But what it said was, in terms of practice, from now on, we're at such a level, such a problematical level, where we actually exist and live in this country, in these places where we live, that we're going to concentrate on trying to intervene in situations to help rebuild that basic level. Because without that basic level, you can't go any further. So that was that's the strategy they've adopted. Now, whether they can do it, whether they can apply it, but it was a rational response to a situation that they face with here. Now, the difference with that is, it's potentially isolated, because it makes you only look at your immediate situation, or your national situation, in fact, despite their supposed international links and all the rest of it. It means that you've decided that you've got a strategy and a policy that only applies here, and it's got nothing to do with what's happening in India or Greece or something else, you know, because they don't produce a political magazine. You know, I'm not talking about all my criticism of that group and its content, but before they had this like dual concept, and now they've got the only concept. Now, I think we have got to do some of the basic work they're talking about. But when I say we, it isn't we, this room, or we, the CWO, because at the end of the day, we are, you know, as individuals or as these small groups, we're not in a position to do that, generally speaking. And generally, you're going to have to work with other people in that situation. They're not necessarily at your political level, because certainly in the workplace, a lot of what you need to do, yes, it's informed by your analysis of the system and the way it's operating at this particular junction in time. It's informed by your communist politics. But when it comes to practical things to do, you need your own experience in that situation to be able to do it. And there are other workers that are just as experienced as you, or better in some cases. You know what I mean? So you've got to be prepared to do that. Now, when I work, I did that. I just feel very isolated now, because I don't even work for a wage or a salary. The sort of place where I live is limited. So the sort of things I do on that practical level are sporadic, rather than in an organised way. And to be fair, the few things I do, I sometimes do with the Solfed or somebody like that, because I just do it with whoever's there, whether it's like a work fair thing or something else, you know. Because I have to accept that in my current social situation, I am on the periphery of opportunities to do that, but I will do what I can when I can. But certainly, you know, Solfed's got a point there. It's just that it thinks it can be the key, the key to doing that, and sometimes it is, you know, but even I've talked to their individual members, and when it comes down to it, they're not really the key. They're just using their organisation with that focus to help them as individuals in places where they work, and they will work with other people and they will do different things, you know. So I'm not arguing for anything in particular that they do. I'm just saying that we need to understand those two levels of organisation. As individuals, we have to be, hopefully as communists, we have some contribution to both those levels of activity, you know. But it would be different probably if we were in I don't know, Farabadad or somewhere in India or even in Greece in the current context. You know, it would be different. There would be a different level. You know, all the different levels of organisations, the people we're working with would be different. That's all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Right, Mark?
Yeah, I just want to come back on a couple of things that were said earlier about organisation and the period that we're in. Size isn't an issue outside of the period of revolutionary struggle, because there's nothing really we can do until the working class starts to move. And the period of the mass party is over. It's not about building the party, and we'll always be in a minority. Yeah, I think these miss the point that I think is key, that that we have to have some orientation. If what we do has no relevance to the working class, then why are we doing it? If, on the other hand, we are part of the working class, becoming conscious of its own historic role in the overthrow of capitalist society and the creation of a world human community, then we do have some responsibility to be better at it. I'm not talking about building the party, I'm not talking about forming a mass party, but I mean, it seems to me that to even posit what I might be saying as being about advocating a mass party is to have a massively disconnected view of where we are from where we need to be. What we've got at the moment isn't even a sketch of the shadow of an outline of the skeleton of the party. The number of steps between here and building the proletariat, building the World Communist Party, if we want to call it that, is so, the number of steps is so huge that that I don't know how anyone can think that at the moment anyone would even suggest, oh, what we need to do is form the party. No, we don't need to form the party, but we at least need to start the process of forming the elements that might at some point go into the format, some of the elements that we can at the moment form that might go into the creation of the party. Yes, obviously the working class will create the World Party, or it won't, but we hope it will. But at the moment, we don't even have I don't think we even have we as the working class have even the toolkit to create the party, let alone the materials and the opportunity and all the rest of it. We need to get to well, the point where the party is, the creation of the party is on the agenda is so far in the future that so far removed from the situation that we're in at the moment, because situations do change. I didn't expect this sudden strike wave in Turkey the other month. That took me completely by surprise. Things can happen, but it's not. It seems to, I don't know. The idea that what I'm talking about is creating the party, it just seems so far away from what I'm actually trying to talk about that I just have to disagree with any attempt to categorise that as being what I'm saying. And I'm looking at you, and I'm looking at you. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. You said the that we're not going to change the balance of power, it's up to the class. And I'm not advocating that we change the balance of power.
Well,
Not
that's-
advocating that we
that's what I'm saying.
leave this room with
No,
red
that's what I'm
flags
saying.
going, we are the Revolutionary Party.
You're-
See, I haven't got my
I don't know where you made that leap from at all. But anyway, Carl.
Thanks, peace.
Kelvin, isn't it?
Okay, what's in a name? Bit like size. Okay, I missed some of what this Nick was saying while I was out the room.
I was
But
basically
there was
saying
stuff
that
about
volunteer-
language. There was a lot. Okay, yeah, that's something. Let's
In
go
a
back to
nutshell.
that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's targeted at a specific audience, but B, it's easy to pick out the most difficult bits and say that sentence is challenging. If most of the other sentences aren't that
I
challenging.
thought I picked
then
out
perhaps
one or
not
two
too
sensible
problem.
bits.
Okay, and anyway, yeah, I mean, you know, well, we continue to work at language, and certainly Mark and I, while we were driving up today, you know, there's specific aspects. You can always read something and say, well, that could have been expressed better, that could have been expressed better. We recognise though, and let's just start off from where Mark was just at. We're a long way away from having a political organisation which has any significant traction within the working class, and ain't no use pretending otherwise. I mean, we never discuss numbers, but the fact is that if you add up CWL with all our international connections, we're still below 10 million. And even
If you were more ambitious.
even when Mark joined us, we're probably still just about below it. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, there's an old term which certainly came across in leftist circles, which was voluntarism, and we you know, none of us want to go in for voluntarism. None of us is saying if only we worked harder, we'd suddenly be bigger and everything would suddenly feel a lot better. I think Mark's right that there's, in our agenda, in our perspectives, there is certainly the task of attracting more conscious communist militants around communist politics, and if the perspective doesn't have that at the centre, then it's a pretty sad sort of perspective. Even given all the background of the retrenchment of the class, of us having been driven back, and I keep using this because I think it's very, very important. The central to our perspective is that we are part of the class. We're part of the class which happens to have thought things out a bit more clearly than most of the rest. But we're not distinct from the class. We're not something coming from outside. We haven't got tablets of stone. We're not sitting at the top of the mountain about to bring it down. We learn from the class. We learn from the class's experience. We crystallise that information, that knowledge, and we bring that back with our theory enriched, and we bring that back for the class in turn to enrich our theory. Well, what's the perspective? Phil, that's okay. So the underlying perspective, and I think this is perfectly intelligible, it's not difficult. We stand for a global society in which production is for need and not profit, therefore sustainable, with the state, national frontiers and money being abolished, where power is exercised through class-wide organisations like workers' councils. Okay, there lots of people picking this up on a demonstration have never read stuff quite that complex before, but the reason why we're giving it out on demonstrations is that we're looking for workers to begin to challenge. It doesn't say Maggie, 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 out, out, out. It doesn't say the bosses are a load of shit and there's greedy bankers. What it's saying is there's a different world possible. Yeah. And that's our, if you like, starting point. And I know Phil wants to hear more than that, because that's sort of taken as read. Okay, so trying to, and again, because Phil threw me this challenge when when I came back from the toilet, and that's fine. Okay, so just looking at this unintelligible document for a minute, and I think there's a whole key clue to our perspective, particularly what Mike said about the multi-layered aspects of what are confront communists today. There's different levels that we have. I mean, Mike's described the self-made conscious decision, so we only tackle one aspect of that. I don't think as an organisation we've said that. We recognise our limitations and we recognise where energies can be well spent and where energies can be wasted and may have been for decades and decades. So I think there's a clue to our short-term perspective, and I think it's quite clear in this document, which Nick doesn't like. So we're talking about a perspective to get rid of the system in itself. This will not come quickly, but will come faster if more people who claim to be socialist go beyond activism and start putting the anti-capitalist argument into the mix on a daily basis. Now, I actually think that sort of sums up some of what Mike was saying, some of what I was trying to say about the Stocksbridge experience. That when the workers who sit in adjacent desk to me turn around and say, "I'm not paying union dues anymore. Look what they've just left us with. This is diabolical." I can't give them an aurora immediately and say, "Look, this explains it." But what I can say is, yeah, we talked about having big meetings. Why do you think the unions didn't do that? All over the world, there's people going through the same sort of crap, and lots of them in Turkey, in Spain, in China. Lots of people are discovering that they have to organise for themselves in new ways, and that the unions really look at it here. They just sit with managers in meeting after meeting. They're really part of the system. They're not part of the answer. So yeah, perhaps 1 in 50 might say, "Well, I was interested. Well, do you know anything more about that Turkey malarkey? Because I've got a mate who's Turkish." You say, "Well, yeah, have a look at this. There's one. Have one for free. Take it away." So, in terms of how we argue for communism, where we consciously adapt to where we are in the class in terms of day-to-day practice, it's not enough to have Bordicker's programmatic declarations of 1951 as, you know, Marx's concept of who's locked in a room and will never get out again. We do something a bit more. We have to recognise that we're operating on lots of fronts at once. One of the fronts we're operating on, and I'm going to have to be quite careful here because I'd like to try and get this roughly right. One of the fronts we're operating on is where we happen to live, to work, to drink, to communicate with, and how do we actually bring communism into that mix. Sometimes there's obvious openings, sometimes there's not obvious openings, and you drip and you try and counter some of the most blatant crap that people talk. You try and encourage little seeds of consciousness, you try and engage, you try and mature, you try and bring people towards a better class consciousness, and you learn from them. You learn from the way they've organised, from the way they've fought back from positive experience, negative experience, and the rest of it. So we're, in that sense, we are integrated in the class, whichever minute of the day we happen to be in. And that's not just being sanctimonious, it's just saying how I think we have to work. At the same time, we know how far we are away from a world party of socialist revolution, a world organisation dedicated to helping the working class overthrow capitalism. as Marx says, we're a long way away from this. But also we've got a very challenging dynamic in that one of the lessons of 1917 to 1919 is if you haven't started to get that process going and moved it as far as you can in advance of the seizure of power, then when there is a seizure of power in an isolated part of the world, then not having the World Party poses all sorts of challenges and makes it difficult. And we don't see the party in the same way as the formal Leninists do, or the formal Stalinists do, or the formal Trotskyists do. So, I mean, I don't think I've actually got time to fully go into that, but we see the need for a revolutionary organisation. So we see the need for engaging with the class. We see the need to develop a revolutionary organisation where we happen to exist, which happens to be in Britain. Well, most importantly, we also see the need to engage with others who are moving towards a communist understanding right across the globe. We know that there is a global economy, as Buchanan put it. We know that the class, ever since its inception, has been a class which is international at its very roots. We have no interest in defending national property and national boundaries, and we know that we share infinitely more with the working class in other parts of the world than we do with our own bourgeoisie. So we aim to spread those germs, to work with others who are spreading those germs of consciousness and developing those germs of consciousness in an international tendency. So and Phil, I'm trying to treat your question seriously, because it's a bit of a golden opportunity if you come out the toilet and someone says, give us your political perspectives. But, you know, this has to be taken seriously and positively. So working with the class where we can, we're working on national territory to develop an organisation, working internationally to develop an organisation. How do we do it? Imperfectly, over the decades, we're making gropingly better use of modern, it's only been around 30 years, technology. You know, we have a website, we engage in dialogue over that computer net thing, and we do all these electronic wizardry things. We also think that there is still a place for paper production. We don't go in for a monthly paper anymore. We think that this sort of bulletin actually is reasonably effective at beginning to talk to the minorities who are open to our ideas. And in practice, Nick, whether you believe this or not, you'd be surprised how many people say, oh yes, I've seen Aurora before, I'll have another one please, and even say things like, we were interested in this, that or the other. So it might appear impenetrable, but there's parts of it which clearly aren't, and there's parts of the audience who we're aiming at to actually respond still to paper documents. So what are those paper documents for? Like this awful, we know it's an awful charade and pantomime that's going on in London. We know that it's a playground to the left where they're trying to confuse people and deceive them and present them with bogus ideas. But we also know that there are working class individuals there who want to resist, who don't want to be shut on anymore, want to find ways forward. So we're not arrogant enough to say, well, they're all confused, they're being misled by the leftists. We'll say, no, there's going to be some there who are going to be open to ideas and are going to want to talk to us and might click on the website tomorrow or in a week's time or whatever, or might even write to us. That only happens once every blue moon these days, people actually writing letters, but there are, you do get occasional ones. So we're interventionist. Within the class, we engage with the class, we engage with fellow communists, we try to build a tendency in this country, we try to build it internationally, I think goodness, that's the perspective.
Okay. Richard.
Well, I was going to be facetious and say, well, Mark's wrong. The party has already been formed. In fact, 3 parties have already been formed in Italy, at least 3 or 4 times over. But that's not really responding to what you said. I don't think that we're actually that far apart in what we're saying. I think I might have been speaking more in generalisations, perhaps, but I don't think we're actually that far apart. Essentially, what I understand you're saying is that the current milieu needs to do more and better, and I don't disagree with that. So I don't actually think we're that far apart. The point I was just trying to make was that we need to avoid some of these negative ideas. I'm not saying that you've got them, but just we need to avoid them.
Just implying that I've got them.
I was just trying to point out that we should try and avoid them. So all I want to say is that I don't think we're actually that far apart, and I am for the uniting. This is a bit grand, but I'm for left communist tendencies working together.
It's Nick now. We've got 4:45. We ought to be sort of bringing it together, really, don't we?
Yeah, we need to make a decision
about next meetings and topics as well. So,
Well, I'm withdrawing my planned folly aimed at Richard after what he just said. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was going to come back as well.
Shall I stop?
Seriously.
Shall I stop this then, or? Oh, you. Oh, so you.
No, sorry. Yeah, because I seriously wasn't implying anything like that, Mark. I was trying to respond to the implication that, you know, somehow it's because we weren't being effective that we were small. It just seems to me we're in a situation, there's nobody to blame for that. It's just what's happened, that's how it's come about. The question is that we should always be asking is, what should we be doing now and how can we do that more effectively? And that I agree with, but not that it could somehow be totally different if we'd have been more effective. And I thought that's the implication of that. So that's the bit I was responding to. Do you want a summary? Do you want to come back?
I think we. It's not about blaming individuals for what somebody did in 1974 or in 1983 or
last year
or whatever, or you know, in 2008. It's about a recognition that our actions have consequences. We can't just use the fact that the working class is not struggling massively in Britain as a way to wipe away our own relative failures to organise properly. That other outcomes to certain events might have been possible even in a situation where the working class is not massively on the offensive in this country. That's all I'm saying. That we can't use the relative class quietude in this country. And I think it's a very good point that we should preface everything within this country or not in this country, depending on whether we're looking at the world situation or just the situation here. But we can't use that as an excuse, is what I'm saying, for our own failures to... for doing nothing, or for doing very little, or not doing things as effectively as we could, or a bunch of other things.
Okay. Yes, we ought to be discussing...
I'll switch this on.
Yeah, okay.
Well, is everybody finished?
Unless somebody else wants to
Anybody
speak.
want to jump in quickly at the end, or...?
No.